All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Just One Man, the podcast taking biblical stories and hopefully giving them some deeper truths to them, diving a little deeper. Hopefully, this podcast will help you to understand some things you learned as a kid, help draw you in closer to God, and strengthen your relationship with Him. 2 weeks in a row, I know you are just as excited and surprised as I am. This week, Noah and the Ark. But we're actually going to do an introduction this week. I was just going to do like the Noah and the Ark story, but really, as I was studying it a lot more throughout the week, felt like some of the history leading up to that was also pretty cool, and helped to give like an even like a big picture kind of look at the whole thing instead of just looking at the event of Noah and the ark itself. Um, so in Genesis chapter 5, like it gives this whole genealogy that's in there that Moses has. And one of the things that I noticed was, at the end of all of those, it says, and he died. Now, Moses is highlighting this record of people that are in line with the Messiah. I mean, obviously, Adam and Eve had more kids than they had, as well as Seth, and so on and so forth. But the point is to highlight the genealogy that leads to the Messiah. Now, you'll probably also notice if you go through that, I mean, these people are living 7, 8, 900 years, whereas today on average we live 75, 80 years. So, Adam only dies 130 years before Noah's born. So wondering again, like, well, how do we know this stuff? I mean, Noah's dad would have had, firsthand account, probably like had coffee on Tuesdays with Adam or something, and they were able to, he was able to hear this stuff firsthand. So, Moses, he doesn't want the readers to miss the fact here, talking about and he died, that death is common to everyone and eventually catches up to us, whether you're 80 or, back then in that case, 800. We find through that like this curious exception at the seventh line of Seth from Adam. We've talked about the number seven before, meaning like whole completeness. So we notice that Enoch lives 365 years and that God took him. The age itself is very interesting, just, like a year for every day in a year. It also suggests like a completing of a whole, adding up a number until the complete whole has been reached. Second, we have Enoch's place in the line of Seth being 7. Remember, Cain's line ended in a seventh as well. Cain, Moses did record some of that, but he stopped at 7 with Lamech, the man who completely and perfectly embodied the sin nature. And so here we have a genealogy that doesn't end in the seventh, but the seventh becomes a stopping point for comparison purposes. So while Cain's line of unbelievers, they were living opposed to God, Seth's line is the seed line, if you will, with men of faith who trace to the Messiah. And in the seventh position, we see Enoch completing a year's worth of days. He walks with God. The Hebrew word for walk is the same for God that was used whenever it's talking about God walking in the garden with Adam. It means fellowship and a close companionship. And then finally, like this intriguing end to Enoch's life. The English phrase says, "For he was not, for God took him." And it's two words in Hebrew, Elohim, God, um, and this other word that just means received or caught or took away. So the meaning is very clear. Enoch, he didn't experience physical death. And the writer of Hebrew affirms that interpretation in chapter 11 when it said, by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death, and he was not found because God took him up. For he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. So that taking away, I mean, that's very strange, unique, and it brings up this question naturally of why did God choose to end Enoch's life so differently from literally everybody else? And so to get that answer, we got to look at other clues of Enoch's age, his position in the seventh line. We got to consider what we know comes after Enoch's departure. Hint, hint, the judgment, the flood that we're going to talk about. More specifically, we got to take note of how New Testament uses the flood story as a picture of the coming judgment also. And these comparisons build more fully as you go through, 6, 7, 8, 9 chapters into Genesis. So let's put some of these details together. All right, so as the seventh in Seth's line, Enoch must stand as the opposite example to Lamech, who was the seventh in Cain's line. They would have been, exact opposites, just as Lamech lived as a testimony to sin. Enoch's life is immediately recognizable as a picture of a man living in faith and walking with God, just like, we just read that in Hebrews 11. So he reaches 365 years, or a completed year of years. He's taken from the earth by God, and then a period of time passes for those who remain behind. But then God's judgment waters come upon the earth, leaving only a few to be rescued. So, do you see God creating this picture for us through Enoch's experience? Enoch is a symbol of a believer. And after an appointed period of time, or once a completed number is reached, then Enoch is removed from the earth. Likewise, the New Testament tells us that once a completed number is reached, the church will be removed from the earth. We call that moment when the church is removed rapture. So Enoch, he becomes this picture of God's mercy in removing the believer from the earth in preparation for the pouring out of judgment. In Enoch's day, the judgment was water, but in 2 Peter 3 says the future judgment will be fire. But as Enoch was rescued from the coming flood, the church will also be rescued from this final judgment that comes to earth. But not before Enoch warned the world that the coming judgment. Jude 14 and 15 explains that to us, and that reads, "It was also about these men that Enoch, in the seventh generation from Adam, prophesied, saying, Behold, the Lord came with many thousands of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to convict all the ungodly of all their ungodly deeds which they have done in an ungodly way, and of all the harsh things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him." So God uses Enoch's life to illustrate his love and mercy for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. But finally, we notice that Enoch's line doesn't end. Genesis chapter 5, verse 25, it says, Methuselah lived 187 years, became the father of Lamech, a different Lamech, not the Lamech from Cain's line, obviously. Then Methuselah lived 782 years after he became the father of Lamech, and he had other sons and daughters. So in all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. So his own son, Methuselah, outlives not only his dad, but every human being at 969 years old. His name means when he dies, it shall be sent. And according to the genealogies in Genesis, the year that Methuselah died was the same year that the flood came upon the earth. So Enoch is even declaring in his son's name a prophetic message of warning of the coming judgment. In fact, notice that one of the men in the line of Methuselah dies, not one of them dies in the flood. All of them have either died naturally prior to the flood, or they're raptured, aka Enoch, or they're rescued, which would be Noah. This is consistent with Peter's teaching that God will rescue the righteous from the coming judgment. All right, and so Lamech is introduced here really just long enough to connect the dots between Methuselah and Lamech's favorite son, which is going to be Noah. Spoiler. We can see that Moses believes that Lamech's son is worth our focused attention because Moses goes out of his way to tell us about the naming of this particular boy. When Lamech named his son, he called him Noah, saying, "He will give us rest from our work and from the toil of the curse of the earth." His name literally means comfort in the sense of rest. Also interesting, if you spell Noah's name backward in Hebrew, it translates into grace. Coincidence? I don't know. But look at Lamech's statement. Is Noah going to accomplish these things? Is Noah going to put an end to our work and the curse of our earth? No. But we can make sense of this statement in two different ways. He may be making a very similar mistake to what Eve made just a few generations earlier. Whenever she first had Cain, she had never birthed children before. She assumed, like, oh, hey, God said I'm going to have that Messiah is going to come for me, that is going to, stomp the head of the serpent. I have now had this kid. This must be who this is. So he must have received an indication from God that Noah would play a special role in God's plan for redemption. But then he just takes it a little too far and assumes that Noah himself is this promised seed. So Lamech names Noah and claims he will put an end to the curse and bring our work to an end. Obviously, he was wrong. But by his statement, Lamech does create through his son a picture of the coming Messiah. For the coming Messiah does give us rest from our work, the work of trying to earn our own salvation, and eventually the Messiah's reign on earth will bring the curse to an end. So now, having inadvertently established his son as a picture of the Messiah's saving work, we can begin with, kind of this pretext to the story of the flood. So in chapter 6, verse 1, it starts off and it reads, "Now it came about, when men began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves whomever they chose. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown." So Moses now begins this story of Noah and the flood. More specifically, Noah moves from talking about Adam's sons to the daughters of men. And the daughters of men become the backstory for why the flood was necessary. Moses sets the scene with this intriguing passage describing intermarriage between daughters of men and sons of God. And there's some debate concerning what Moses is describing here, but in all honesty, I think it's pretty straightforward. First, notice that whatever Moses is describing in those first two verses, the obvious point is that this event is notable and unusual. Otherwise, why make the effort to describe marriage in a normal sense? Furthermore, the terms Moses uses, that tells us that this isn't a typical marriage. He says the daughters of men, which is easy enough to understand. Then Moses says these daughters were attracting the attention of the sons of God. Now, the Hebrew for that is Behin Elohim. And the Bible never refers to natural men as the sons of God. It doesn't. And the only other reference to this Hebrew word here is found in Job, and it only refers to angels. So, since we don't have a translation for it here, and the only other place in the Bible that it is mentioned is in Job, then we have to assume that the translation is the same here as well. Even in the Septuagint, which is the Hebrew Bible translated into Greek, it's translated as sons of God. That's translated as angels of God. So if these were angels, then we got to conclude that these angels were of the demonic kind. They were disobedient, fallen angels. Jude actually gives us a confirmation of this in 6 and 7. He says, "And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, he has kept in eternal bonds under darkness for judgment in the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities around them, since they in the same way as these indulged in gross immorality and went after strange flesh, are exhibited as an example in undergoing the punishment of eternal fire." So Jude says that the angels didn't keep their own domain, but went after strange flesh. These demons are now undergoing punishment of eternal fire as examples. And as we look in the text in Genesis 6, we also find some interesting parallels to Genesis 3. In Genesis 3, we're told that the woman saw the fruit was good and took it. Genesis 6:2, the demon realm does exactly the same thing to woman. They look, see that woman is beautiful, and take her. This is an act of rebellion. This is an act of sin. So then the question becomes, well, why would they want to mate with women? Angels don't have the same sexual drive that we do. They don't have an interest in mating. So that answer to that question really brings us back to the theme of the book of Genesis, and that is the seed that will fulfill God's promise to redeem men from sin. The demons and their master Satan, they understand God has promised to crush them with a Messiah, with a seed who comes in keeping with God's promise in the garden. But that seed will come through woman specifically. The promise of the coming Messiah was given to Eve and was a privilege that women would share. In fact, it's been said that the desire of every Jewish girl's heart was that she might have the blessing of birthing the Messiah. So therefore, the demons began to mate with women to corrupt the human race and the seed line to the Messiah. If the lines of men were sufficiently corrupt, then there would be no seed line available for God to carry through his promise. How could such an unholy union be possible? We remember from other passages of Scripture that angels, demons, have the ability to appear to men in human form, and they can convey a very convincing illusion. In a later account, Abraham, we see him eat with angels and not know who they are, at least at first. In the story of Lot, when he's visited by the two angels that appear to be men and take Lot by the hand and lead him out of the city. So we can accept that demons have the ability to imitate and counterfeit human flesh, including the seed of men. So the prospect of demons mating with women isn't impossible to accept under these circumstances, but what of the offspring? The passage gives us a description in verse 4. The Bible calls them Nephilim, which means fallen ones in Hebrew. But the Septuagint chose to translate the Hebrew word into gigantes in Greek, rather than leaving it as a proper noun. And that means giant in English, but the original Hebrew was not trying to suggest that the offspring of angels and women were giants. In fact, that would have just been weird if the offspring were indistinguishable from normal men. I mean, they would have mixed, they wouldn't have mixed in easily if that were the case. If you're trying to disrupt a seed line, I mean, you would kind of just want them to look like a regular person, right? Not some weird giant deformity. So then in the text, verse 4, there's a little bit of a confusing statement that we want to try to clarify. Moses says that the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. And some think Moses is implying to that this intermarriage continued after the flood. They even cite Numbers and the story of the 10 spies who reported seeing the Nephilim in the Promised Land. Well, you got to remember that report was a lie, okay, as the story in Numbers eventually tells us, okay? They gave a false report trying to persuade the people of Israel not to enter the city because they were afraid of the Canaanites. And so really it's the syntax of the Hebrew in Genesis 6 that is the cause for the confusion. If we read it in Hebrew, we find that the phrase "and afterward" is connected to the second half of the sentence not in the first half. So the afterword is simply just a connecting word in Hebrew to introduce what happened after the demons mated with women. The offspring are called Nephilim, fallen ones, but they pose a new and significant threat to this plan that God has for mankind. So the introduction of fallen angels into the genealogy of mankind would interfere with God's plan to bring a Messiah into the world as a man. Messiah must share in the nature of man in order to redeem man. If man's nature has been corrupted into one that shares the demon nature, God's plan to bring the Messiah would be thwarted. So then in verse 3, God says, His spirit shall not strive with men forever. The Hebrew word for strive is unique, making it difficult to define since it only occurs in this one spot in the whole Bible. So it probably means to remain with man, as in to keep his physical body alive. Remember that God breathed his spirit into man, bringing Adam to life. But that joining of spirit and flesh was no longer permanent. Flesh was now destined to perish because of the curse on the ground. So God is saying that all flesh is destined to die sooner or later, and now the flesh of men was being systematically corrupted by these demons. So God declares that if an end to flesh is inevitable anyway, He's now going to set a limit to how long flesh will remain on the earth. So after 120 years, God is saying He's going to put an end to all corrupted flesh on the earth. And this becomes a countdown timer until the flood strikes the earth. And it explains the need for such a drastic response on God's part. If man's sin alone was enough to destroy the world, we should have expected to see it happen many times over. Let's pick up the story in verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. The Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, from man to animals, to creeping things, and to birds of the sky, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. To ensure we have a proper understanding of why the flood occurs, Moses describes a second reason for God's actions. While the demonic realm was working to undermine God's plan, the sin of men was also growing to unsustainable levels on the earth. The wickedness of man was great, we're told. Men have always been sinful, but in the world that existed after the garden, there was little to restrain the power of sin in society. That only means God provided for the restraint of sin after the fall was the conscience of man. God hadn't instituted government, death penalty, hadn't delivered his law. So man's sin is only governed by his own conscience, and Moses explains that man's internal thoughts and imagination were evil continually. The word imagination is yatsar. It's the same word used in Genesis 2:7 to describe how God created man out of the dust of the ground. God used his creative powers to produce something good, but corrupted man now uses his creative powers to construct evil continually. The point of Moses' description is that man's conscience has been shown unable to restrain man's sin. Apart from the chosen seed line through Seth, men became entirely evil because the sin nature cannot be restrained by our conscience. And now the sheer number of people combined with their unrestrained sinfulness, it has reached a level God no longer can accept. Then Moses said that God was sad and that he regretted even making man. Some English versions may even say God repented of making man. Whenever we see this description of God, we have to understand it in light of all Scripture. For example, Scripture teaches clearly that God doesn't change his mind in the sense of a man. We change our mind when we learn new information that alters our understanding and leads us to different conclusions. This doesn't happen with God. So we must understand verse 6 in light of this biblical truth. In this case, Moses says God was sorry that he made man, but the sense of it in light of all Scripture is that God was grateful was that God was regretful for how his creation had deteriorated. The statement doesn't imply surprise over the circumstance, much less a changed attitude toward creation. The fact that God planned for this moment doesn't mean that it didn't pain him when it finally gets here. Rather, God always displays regret or sorrow in the face of sin. And so he displays sorrow when he witnesses how man's sin progresses to these extreme levels. In fact, notice in verse 7 that God's sorrow extends beyond man to include land animals and birds. Clearly, sorrow doesn't mean that God feels he made a mistake or changed his mind. His sorrow is dissatisfaction in the way sin has overtaken creation. That disappointment was so great that God was grieved and forced to act in response. God's response is a worldwide judgment that will blot out all of these creatures. God's response will result in the elimination of all creatures that have a life blood is the Hebrew phrase that is used. And so with that, notice that fish are excluded, further confirming that they are not considered to be creatures with the Hebrew word life blood is che nefesh. Okay, we've gone through this before. My Hebrew is terrible. My English is so-so. So this is going to be a worldwide judgment from which there is no escape. And as we progress through the story of Noah, we're going to take time as we go through this next week, and we will examine these prophetic clues that God has left for us in this story. By that, I mean symbols, pictures, shadows, other markers taken from the account of Noah that point prophetically to a future moment. So as we begin the story of Noah, just setting the stage for this comparison by highlighting our first clue and our first marker today. So Moses opens the story of Noah by describing the times and circumstances. And these very interesting parallel here with something that Jesus says in Matthew 24:37 through 39. Jesus said, "For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah. For as in those days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark. And they did not understand until the flood came and took them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man be." So Jesus tells us his second coming will occur at a time and under circumstances similar to the days of Noah. Well, in what way are they similar? Well, there are three ways in which they are comparable. One of those Jesus gives us in verses 38 and 39. First, the days of Noah are marked by hyperactivity among the demonic realm. In Noah's days, demons are mating with women. In the days immediately before Jesus' return, in Revelation, it describes a world in which the Antichrist has been revealed. And there's this man. He will die in the middle of the 7-year tribulation. After 3 days, his body will come back to life. The source of his new life is actually the indwelling of Satan. The Antichrist soul remains in hell, but the body is used by Satan to construct this counterfeit resurrection. And this is the kind of extreme demonic mixing with humans that mirrors the activity in Noah's day. Secondly, the depravity of men, which will reach extreme levels. Paul describes this future in 2 Timothy when he says this in chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. But realize this, that in the last days, difficult times will come. Men will be lovers of self, lovers of money, boastful, arrogant, revilers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, irreconcilable, malicious gossips, without self-control, brutal, haters of good, treacherous, reckless, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, holding to a form of godliness, although they have denied its power. Avoid such men as these. Remember, Paul isn't saying that these kinds of sin are unique to the end of times. He's just saying that the last days are marked because all men become this way. The world as a whole acts this way rather than just the worst of society. Now, it's obviously clear that we are moving steadily in this direction. And then finally, Jesus gives us a third way in which the circumstance of Noah's day mirrors the time of his return. The world is oblivious, even hostile to the notion of his return. Verse 39, Jesus says they didn't understand until the flood came. They didn't understand that Noah's warnings were true. They didn't understand that God would bring judgment for sin. They didn't understand that they would be included in this judgment. And today we can see that same kind of attitude toward the world itself. Spend 15 minutes on social media, and that'll be blatantly obvious to most people. So as we dive into the story of Noah next week, we'll continue to take a look at some of these parallels between those. So that's it. That's it for today's show. Short and sweet, 30 minutes. Didn't want to cover all of this and then also try to cover the flood story in the same episode. That would have been a whole lot to digest. So next week, we'll get into the rest of that story, and we'll go through, all of that, and hopefully cover some pretty common misconceptions with that when we're talking about animals on the ark and stuff like that. So until next week, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it. If you have any feedback, especially on sound quality, because I've been messing around with some stuff, I'd love some feedback on that. If you have any questions or anything, let me know. I think after this, at some point within the next few months, we'll probably start in the book of Revelation. Still haven't decided if I'm just going to do that week by week or just record it in advance and then just drop it, just in case I happen to be inconsistent. So next week, we'll go for 3 weeks in a row. Again, thanks for listening to the show. You can follow me on Twitter at BrandonTubbs24. You can follow me on Instagram at OKestBrandon. You don't need to support the show, but if you want to, there's a Patreon account for it. The best thing you can do to support the show is, just use the information that you learn from here to be able to minister to the people that are in your lives, and help just to reach those people for God and to grow his kingdom. So until next week, thank you all so much.